Welcome to Channel 24. Fredrik Löjdquist, director of the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies, here with me in studio. Fredrik, welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to be here with you.
Thank you. I recently came across a column in the Financial Times titled "Mark Carney's Trial by G7 Summit as Godzilla Comes to Canada." And, it suggested that many leaders at the summit are more concerned with how Trump will react than with what G7 actually decides. And, that strikes me because to what extent, from your perspective, has Europe's foreign policy become shaped by fears of, Trump's decisions and reactions, but not its own strategic interests?
Of course, there's always the danger and risk that you're talking about, and I think it's important that Europe remembers that we have the individual countries and the European Union. We have our own agency, and it's not only Putin and Trump or whoever who has anything to say in this. But I also think that European political leaders have shown initiative and agency since the beginning of this year. There has been much talk about increasing European defense capabilities and also in the longer term European deterrence capabilities. Unfortunately, I think there has been less discussions on the other two political goals that needs to be pursued now. The second one is, of course, to support Ukraine military to defend its sovereignty and its territory. And the third one is how to further constrain Russia's war efforts and contain Russia. But there is an ongoing discussion, and I think there has been made clear by statements by the German Chancellor Merz, by Macron, by Keir Starmer and others. So I think there's a serious discussion about these things going on in Europe right now.
Yeah, you're right. Those leaders are trying hard, but still, don't you think we are afraid in Ukraine that very sad situation on the between Israel and Iran could overshadow the Russian war in Ukraine? Don't you think so?
Of course, there's always the question of sort of political priorities and bandwidth. How much can you focus on different things? I think it's still too early to say anything about the long-term consequences about Israel's attacks on Iran. A couple of immediate consequences are, of course, that the oil prices went up, which is good for Russia. And I saw now this afternoon that they're going down again. And another consequence is that Iran has now stopped its deliveries of weapons, ballistic missiles, and of drones to Russia. But of course, I think the U.S. administration and Trump will have to focus very much on the situation in and around Iran now.
There is one question that going round and round in my head. If Europe continues to, fear Trump more than it trusts its own diplomatic instincts, is that not in itself a victory for Russia's divide and distract strategy?
Well, I don't think, there's necessarily a fear for Trump that is characterizing the situation right now. But of course, you're right in the sense that Russia is trying to exploit this sort of ambiguities and some uncertainties that are now and try to weaken the transatlantic link, the West, and also European unity and so forth. And that has been a very clear goal of Putin since a very long time.
Yeah. When you're saying that Macron or Starmer, they all discuss and how they can push on Russia more, from your perspective, what should Europe, to do to stop, not to look over its own shoulder of what the Kremlin says, but instead make Moscow worry about the mood and messages coming out from European capitals, from European leaders?
Well, of course, it's important to send a clear, message to Moscow, strategic signaling that Europe is united and that we understand the nature of the Russian threat. This is now about Ukraine, but this is not only about Ukraine. It's about the whole idea of European project of peace and stability in Europe, which Russia is threatening. And I think that signal is coming out clearer, but of course there's more that can be done in terms of financial and military support to Ukraine, and more could be done also to constrain Russia's war efforts through sanctions, but also through other means.
Do you believe that the United States will impose those sanctions they are threatening to Putin?
Well, this Lindsey Graham and other senators' initiative, I think that remains to be seen. I think that the threat is there, and that there is a large majority in the Senate for this. But whether they will actually be implemented or not, I think it's a very open question.
Yeah. You know, when you're opening the international media, they all asking a question, a lot of them, a lot of columnists and journalists. How is Russia still able to convince the world it's winning this war? Yes, they advanced in May, and it was their strongest advancement since 2022, I guess. But it's still, you know, Fredrik, it's still limited. Why does this illusion work?
Well, Russia has been quite successful, and this, I think, is one of their most successful weapons, is what you could call the cognitive warfare, or the warfare on our minds. It's a sort of meta level of disinformation. Sometimes it's called reflexive control. And one of these narratives that Russia is trying to exploit and use and put in the minds is, of course, the one of Russian invincibility, that Russia is so strong, and also of Ukrainian weakness. And I think it's important that we keep our heads clear here. Russia is not different than any other country. It's a country that faces serious economic constraints. And the size of the EU economies put together is 10 times that of Russia. So we need to keep a clear eye on the basic underlying facts here. But Russia is trying to really use this narrative that Ukraine is weak and Russia is strong, time is on Russia's side, and so forth. And therefore, it's important that we sort of deconstruct these Russian myths that they are trying. And they have also, you know, through disinformation in Europe, but perhaps especially in the US, they have been quite successful in some parts of the societies to spread this picture.
Does Russian propaganda is very strong in Sweden and other European countries?
Well, I think, you know, Russian propaganda and disinformation is everywhere. I think in Sweden, we are quite immune or have a very strong resilience against that. And I think there's a very broad political consensus. All 8 parliamentary parties in Sweden are in agreement of the nature of the Russian threat and the steps that we need to take now, both in supporting Ukraine. Sweden is a big supporter of Ukraine, both in relative and absolute terms, but also when it comes to strengthening our own defense capabilities.
When I was listening to one of your conferences you shared at the Security Forum in Kyiv, you said something like, maybe I'm mistaken, but I remember the idea, you said that we don't have to stay like a frozen deer in the wood. Maybe it's not literally what you said, but I remember the picture in my head. So do you think something is changing in the behavior of Western politicians?
Well, I think we have seen over time, and since the large-scale invasion starting in 2022, it has been quite a wake-up call, and we have come a long way. I think still there's more that needs to be done. What I meant by this was that we shouldn't be paralyzed and lose our own agency and the own resources we have. We have to remember that Europe, approximately so far since February 2022, has supported Ukraine military and economically, financially, with slightly less than 150 billion euros. You can put that in relationship to the more than 800 billion euros that the EU was able to mobilize in sort of post-COVID subsidies and so forth. So this is not as much as a question of resources or money. We have the resources. It's a question of political resolve and will. And for that, you need to have a proper understanding of the problem and also political leadership to explain that to the voters.
But I see, what risk do you see in the West continuing to kind of tolerate or legitimize Russia's, frozen conflicts model?
I think this is a real risk, and I think there is a danger in this illusion, this illusory thinking that there is some kind of a deal that we can strike with Russia that is mutually beneficial, and that can lead to a new stability and security, and eventually lead to peace. And I think the real question here we have to ask: will Russia be will we allow Russia to harvest fruits of its aggression against Ukraine? Because if Kremlin can draw the conclusion that this most large-scale and most brutal military aggression on European soil since the Second World War, in combination with nuclear blackmail, is a successful tool, successful means to achieve their political goals, then we live in a very dangerous world. So there can only be, and the idea is that Russia will settle, that you can do a sort of land for peace deal, and that Russia will settle only for control over some regions in southern and eastern Ukraine, I think is a very dangerous illusion. Russia's war aims is very clear, and it's the total subjugation of Ukraine and the end of Ukraine as a sovereign independent state. And they will use different means. Then they can also use the negotiation table to try to achieve those goals, but the goals haven't changed, and I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I wish.
The idea that actually by trying to push what seems to be a de-escalation or a ceasefire or something like that, that in itself actually can be escalatory and incentivize Russia for more escalation later on. And we saw this happen with the Minsk agreements, the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, because we thought that they would pacify the situation, lead to a de-escalation and negotiations, and instead they helped to enable Russia's large-scale invasion from 2022. So I think there are important lessons to be learned from the past here.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you take seriously that the warning from NATO's Secretary General that Russia could attack an alliance members within 5 years? Does Moscow really want more European territories beyond Ukraine, as you mentioned?
I think, Russia has an immediate war aim in Ukraine, but it also has larger, more strategic aims, and that is to change the shape of the European security landscape. We saw that clearly with this so-called treaty proposals they put forward in mid-December 2021. They want to undermine the transatlantic link. They want to put doubt on EU and NATO resolve and so forth. And I think that's the real aim. I don't think they have to invade a NATO ally to do that. They will try to achieve that through other means, through hybrid warfare, hybrid aggression. I think still Russia respects Article 5, and they also realize that they don't have the military or economic resources for a military conflict with a NATO ally and with NATO. But that doesn't mean that there's no Russian threat. And as I said, they can have other means to try to achieve that.
Yeah, absolutely true.
And also, you discuss scenarios, what can happen in 3 or 5 or 7 years. I'm a little bit skeptical about the reasoning or the thinking behind these scenarios, because it's like we're asking the question to ourselves as we were outside objective bystanders observing the situation and making predictions about the future. The outcome will depend very much on how much the West will provide Ukraine with support for it to be able to defend itself, and how much we can constrain Russia's war efforts and so forth. So we are very much part of this equation. So will it be 3 years or 5 years or 7 years? Well, that depends on what we are doing now. But I think the worst outcome is that if Putin and the Kremlin will conclude that this has been successful for them, because then we will only see more of it.
Absolutely. And, when you're opening international economic media outlets, you see that the sanctions, they are working. Because I really rely on sanctions that could be imposed by Washington again. And I really rely on them because, that's a long game. But we see the results. Well, it's a serious thing happening right now. What I'm reading, from the Western journalists, that's very impressive.
No, it is. The sanctions are working. Much more can be done by improving the existing sanctions, introducing new sanctions, and we also have to work with sanctions implementations from our side, the countries that are sanctioning Russia. And there has been a lot of sort of Russian disinformation and propaganda and so forth that the sanctions are not working. But the proof that they are working, that the Russian representatives, the first thing they bring up when talking about possible negotiations is that the West needs to lift the sanctions, and that means that the sanctions are working.
Yeah, absolutely. We saw how Trump's idea of mediating with Putin and Ukrainian president failed and perhaps even made some things worse, let's be clear. Do you believe any American administration can actually restrain Moscow?
Oh, yes, I think, no. I mean, of course, the U.S. has significant tools to restrain Moscow. I think we're still trying to understand really what the Trump administration's long game is and if it may change or not. But it also has, started a serious discussion now in Europe and how Europe can do more to invest in our own security and our own responsibility for Europe's future and security. And I think that's in itself is also a good thing. And it seems that there will be a good result coming out from the upcoming NATO summit in this respect.
Yeah. Mr. Löjdquist, I recently came across a paper, and I think thanks to you I found it, that tried to clearly define what a Ukrainian victory would look like. And it strikes me how little we talk about that and how much we focus instead on just ending the war. Why is that?
Well, I think there is sometimes, unfortunately, quite confusing discussions about these concepts of victory and defeat. And sometimes people speak about this war as it was some kind of a football game with two equal players, and one losing and one winning. And I think that's a dangerous metaphor, because if we're trying to define what is a Ukrainian victory, well, Ukrainian victory is that Ukraine will be able to defend its sovereignty, its independence, and its territory. And that means actually Russia loses nothing. It only goes back to the international recognized border, and it goes back to the international respect for international law, the UN Charter, and the European Security Order. And that's not only a victory for Ukraine; it's a victory for everyone, and it's a victory for international law. However, a Russian victory means not only a defeat and the end of Ukraine as we know it, but it also means the end of respect for international law, the Helsinki Final Act, and so forth. So these are not symmetric concepts, so to say. But sometimes I get a feeling that some people are afraid of speaking about Ukrainian victory because it sounds like Ukrainian victory means like foreign troops are marching into the Red Square, occupying Russia. That's not at all what it's about. If Russia leaves Ukraine tomorrow, we will have peace and Ukrainian victory, and the war will end. But there will not be peace if Russia can harvest fruits of its aggression in Ukraine.